The morning of April 5, 1992, came to northwest Arkansas the way most mornings did. Quiet, unhurried, the Ozark Hills still touched with the pale light of early spring. In Bentonville, a town of fewer than 12,000 people, the streets remained empty at dawn. Pickup trucks sat parked in driveways. Church bells had not yet rung. The world, for a moment, held its breath. Somewhere in Little Rock, 130 miles to the southeast, a man lay dying. Sam Walton, 74 years old, founder of Walmart, the largest retailer on the planet, had been moved to the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences Hospital weeks earlier. Multiple myeloma, a cancer of the bone marrow, had been consuming him for nearly a decade. The official diagnosis had come in 1982, a quiet sentence handed down by doctors who gave him perhaps 3 years to live. He defied that prognosis for 10, but by the spring of 1992, there was nothing left to defy. The family gathered, his wife Helen, married to him since 1943. His 4 children, Rob, John, Jim, and Alice, now adults. Now inheritors of a fortune so vast, it defied ordinary comprehension. By some estimates, the Walton family's combined net worth exceeded $60 billion. And yet, in the sterile confines of a hospital room, such numbers meant nothing at all. Sam Walton died that Sunday morning. The announcement, when it came, was brief. A family spokesman confirmed the passing. Tributes poured in from business leaders and politicians. President George H.W. Bush called Walton an American original. The flags at Walmart stores across the country were lowered to half-staff. In Bentonville, residents spoke in hushed tones, as if the man who had built their town into something more than a forgotten corner of the Ozarks had simply gone to sleep and would wake again. But the silence that followed Sam Walton's death was not merely the silence of mourning. It was something deeper, something practiced. Back in Bentonville, the house on Southeast 8th Street stood as it always had. Modest, unassuming, almost absurdly ordinary for a man once named the richest person in America. A 3-bedroom home, a carport, a lawn like any other lawn. There were no gates, no guards, no visible markers of the empire that had been built from within those walls. Neighbors had long grown accustomed to seeing Sam mow his own grass, drive his old red pickup truck into town, stop at the local barber shop for a $5 haircut. The mythology of his humility had become inseparable from the man himself. And yet, mythology is always incomplete. What happened inside that house in the weeks and months after Sam Walton's death remains, to this day, obscured. The transition of power at Walmart, the world's largest private employer, occurred with remarkable speed and remarkable opacity. Rob Walton, the eldest son, assumed the role of chairman. The company released carefully worded statements. The family retreated further into privacy, a privacy so total it bordered on disappearance. There were no public disputes, no visible fractures, no tell-all interviews or leaked documents. The Waltons, unlike so many dynasties before them, did not air their grievances in the light. They did not speak to the press. They did not explain themselves. They simply continued, as they always had, in silence. But silence, in the world of immense wealth and immense power, is never neutral. It is a choice. It is a strategy. And in the case of the Walton family, it would become a defining feature of their legacy. A wall built not of stone, but of discipline, behind which the true nature of their empire remained hidden. The house on Southeast 8th Street still stands. It has been preserved, in a sense, as a monument, not to the man who lived there, but to the idea of the man, the humble billionaire, the folksy entrepreneur, the American dream made flesh. But every monument casts a shadow, and in the years that followed Sam Walton's death, that shadow would grow longer and darker, touching not only the family, but the nation itself. Questions would arise about labor practices, about political influence, about the human cost of low prices. The Waltons would become, depending on whom you asked, either the guardians of American enterprise or its quiet destroyers. None of that, however, was visible on the morning of April 5, 1992. There was only the silence of a small town, the stillness of an empty house, and the end of a man whose story had become too large for any single telling. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. Samuel Moore Walton was born on March 29, 1918, in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, a town carved into the flat, wind-scoured plains of the American heartland. His father, Thomas Gibson Walton, was a farmer's son who had abandoned farming. His mother, Nancy Lee, was a woman of fierce discipline and quiet determination. The family was not poor, but they were never secure. They lived in that precarious space between modest comfort and genuine hardship, where a single bad season or a single miscalculation could mean ruin. The Waltons moved often, from Kingfisher to Springfield, Missouri, from Springfield to Marshall, from Marshall to Shelbina. Thomas Walton worked as a farm mortgage agent, a job that required him to travel the back roads of Missouri, visiting farmers who could not pay their debts, negotiating terms, sometimes repossessing land. It was the Great Depression. The work was steady, but it was not kind. Young Sam watched his father operate in this world, a world where survival depended on negotiation, on reading people, on understanding the difference between what a man said and what he meant. Thomas Walton was not a cruel man, but he was a pragmatic one. He taught his son that sentiment had no place in business, that a deal was a deal, that the world did not reward those who hesitated. These lessons took root. By all accounts, Sam Walton was an unusual child, relentlessly energetic, intensely competitive, possessed of a charm that could disarm even the most skeptical adults. He delivered newspapers. He sold magazine subscriptions. He raised and sold rabbits and pigeons. By the time he reached high school, he had already internalized a truth that would define his entire life. Money was not simply a means to an end. It was a measure of effort, of will, of worth. He excelled at everything he attempted. He was quarterback of the football team. He was president of the student body. He was voted most versatile boy in his senior class. There was, even then, something almost compulsive about his need to succeed, a hunger that went beyond ordinary ambition. Those who knew him in those years would later describe a young man who seemed incapable of rest, who filled every hour with activity, who treated leisure as a kind of failure. In 1936, Walton enrolled at the University of Missouri. He studied economics, joined a fraternity, and continued his pattern of accumulation, not merely of money, but of connections, of influence, of social capital. He worked his way through college, as many did in that era, but he did so with a peculiar intensity. He was not simply surviving, he was preparing. After graduation, he took a job as a management trainee at J.C. Penney in Des Moines, Iowa. The salary was $75 a month. The work was unglamorous, stocking shelves, assisting customers, learning the mechanics of retail from the ground up. But Walton absorbed everything. He studied the way merchandise was displayed. He watched how customers moved through the store. He listened to what they said and what they did not say. Retail, he came to understand, was not merely a transaction. It was a relationship, and relationships could be engineered. The war intervened. In 1942, Walton joined the Army, serving as a captain in the Intelligence Corps. He oversaw security at aircraft plants and prisoner of war camps. The work was administrative, far from combat, but it gave him something he had not possessed before, a sense of scale. The military was a vast machine, impersonal and efficient, and Walton learned how such machines operated, how orders flowed downward, how discipline was maintained, how thousands of individuals could be coordinated toward a single purpose. When the war ended, he returned to civilian life with a wife, Helen Robson, whom he had married in 1943, and a small amount of capital. He was 27 years old. He had no inheritance, no family connections, no advantages beyond his own energy and intelligence. But he had a vision, still unformed, of what he might build. In 1945, Walton used a loan from his father-in-law to purchase a Ben Franklin variety store in Newport, Arkansas. The town was small, unremarkable, a place most ambitious men would have seen as a dead end. Walton saw something else. He saw a laboratory. For 5 years he experimented. He bought merchandise directly from manufacturers, bypassing wholesalers, cutting costs. He extended store hours. He staged promotions and sales that drew customers from neighboring towns. He studied his competitors with an almost clinical detachment, visiting their stores, noting their prices, analyzing their weaknesses. The Newport store became the most profitable Ben Franklin franchise in the region, and then, in 1950, he lost it. The landlord, recognizing the store's success, refused to renew Walton's lease. There was no recourse. The business Walton had built over 5 years, the relationships, the reputation, the momentum, evaporated overnight. He was forced to sell and start again. It was, by his own later admission, the most painful experience of his professional life. But it was also instructive. Sam Walton learned in that moment a lesson he would never forget. Control mattered more than profit. Ownership mattered more than success. He would never again allow himself to be vulnerable to another man's decision. He moved his family to Bentonville, a town even smaller than Newport, and opened a new store. He called it Walton's Five and Dime. And from that modest beginning, in a place most Americans could not find on a map, he began to build something unprecedented. But the hunger that drove him, the need to win, to expand, to dominate, had a quality that those closest to him could not always name. The first Walmart opened on July 6, 1962, in Rogers, Arkansas, a town of 6,000 people, 18 miles from Bentonville. The building was unremarkable. The signage was plain. The merchandise was stacked on simple tables and metal racks, with none of the polish or presentation of the department stores that dominated American retail. To the casual observer, it looked like a dead end, another discount store in a region too poor and too rural to matter. Sam Walton saw it differently, or he had spent the previous decade studying the discount retail model as it emerged in the urban centers of the Northeast. Stores like E.J. Corvette in New York and Kmart in Michigan were proving that high volume and low margins could generate extraordinary profits. But these retailers focused on cities, on population density, on markets large enough to sustain their ambitions. They ignored small towns. They ignored the countryside. They ignored places like Rogers, Arkansas. Walton understood what they had missed. Rural America was not empty. It was underserved. Millions of people lived in towns too small to attract major retailers, forced to drive long distances for basic goods or pay inflated prices at local stores with limited selection. These customers were not wealthy, but they were loyal. They were hungry for value, and they had nowhere else to go. The strategy was simple, almost brutal in its clarity. Open stores in small towns. Negotiate relentlessly with suppliers to secure the lowest possible prices. Pass those savings on to customers. Undercut every competitor. Expand before anyone else recognized the opportunity. Within 5 years, there were 24 Walmart stores across Arkansas and neighboring states. Within a decade, there were nearly 150. The company went public in 1970, and the influx of capital accelerated an expansion that already seemed unstoppable. By the mid-1970s, Walmart had become a regional force. By the early 1980s, it was a national phenomenon. By 1990, it had surpassed Sears and Kmart to become the largest retailer in the United States. The numbers were staggering. Revenues that had been measured in millions were now measured in billions. The company opened new stores at a rate that defied comprehension, sometimes 3 or 4 per week. Distribution centers spread across the country like nodes in a vast nervous system, coordinating the movement of goods with military precision. Walmart's logistics operation became a case study in efficiency, studied and imitated by businesses around the world. At the center of this empire stood Sam Walton, a figure who seemed, even as his wealth multiplied beyond imagination, to resist the trappings of success. He still drove his old pickup truck. He still wore the same khaki pants and baseball caps. He still visited stores unannounced, walking the aisles, talking to employees. Associates, he insisted on calling them, gathering information, testing ideas. His Saturday morning meetings at the Bentonville headquarters became legendary. Hundreds of managers packed into an auditorium, cheering, chanting company slogans, listening as Walton preached the gospel of low prices and customer service. It was, by any measure, a remarkable performance. And performance is precisely what it was. Behind the folksy exterior, Sam Walton was a man of relentless calculation. He monitored competitors with obsessive intensity, dispatching employees to photograph store layouts and record prices. He squeezed suppliers until they had no margin left, demanding cost reductions that often forced manufacturers to move production overseas or cut wages. He resisted unionization with a ferocity that surprised even his allies, deploying teams of lawyers and consultants to crush organizing efforts before they could gain traction. The human cost of this efficiency was, from the beginning, a subject of quiet concern. Walmart's wages were low, often the lowest in the retail industry. Benefits were limited. Turnover was high. Workers who complained were let go. Workers who organized were fired. The company cultivated a culture of loyalty that some observers described as familial and others described as coercive. The line between the two was never entirely clear. In the small towns where Walmart opened stores, the pattern repeated itself with eerie consistency. Local businesses, hardware stores, pharmacies, grocery shops that had served their communities for generations found themselves unable to compete. Prices they could not match. Selection they could not replicate. Within months, sometimes weeks, they closed. Main streets that had once been the commercial hearts of their towns fell silent. The jobs Walmart created replaced the jobs Walmart destroyed, but the exchange was never equal. Something was lost that could not be measured in wages or prices. None of this diminished Sam Walton's reputation. If anything, it enhanced it. He was celebrated as a visionary, a disruptor, a man who had democratized consumption, who had given ordinary Americans access to goods they could not otherwise afford. The critics were dismissed as elitists, as sentimentalists, as people who did not understand the realities of modern business. And perhaps they did not. Perhaps the transformation Walton had unleashed was inevitable, a force of economic nature that would have emerged with or without him. Perhaps the small towns mourning their lost shops were mourning something that had already died. But in Bentonville, in the house on Southeast 8th Street, Sam Walton continued to live as he always had, simply, quietly, invisibly. The richest man in America, surrounded by the machinery of his creation, watching it grow beyond his control. The cancer had already taken hold. The house on Southeast 8th Street was never meant to be a monument. It was purchased in 1950, the same year Sam Walton arrived in Bentonville, defeated and determined after losing his Newport store. The price was modest. The structure was unremarkable. 3 bedrooms, a single story, a lawn that stretched toward the street without fence or barrier. It was the kind of house a middle-class family might own. Comfortable, practical, forgettable. Sam Walton could have moved. As the years passed and his wealth accumulated, as Walmart spread across the country and his net worth climbed into the billions, he could have built something grander. His peers in the world of American business, the executives, the industrialists, the financiers, constructed estates that announced their success. Mansions in Connecticut, compounds in Palm Beach, ranches in Texas measured in tens of thousands of acres. These were men who understood that wealth, to be real, must be visible. Walton refused. He remained in the house on 8th Street for more than 4 decades, raising his children in the same rooms where he had once struggled to rebuild his career. The furniture was plain. The decorations were sparse. Visitors who expected to find the trappings of immense fortune were invariably startled by what they encountered, a home that seemed frozen in time, untouched by the empire that had grown around it. The reasons for this choice were never fully articulated. Walton himself spoke of it in terms of values, of humility, of a distaste for ostentation. He told interviewers that he saw no purpose in extravagance, that material possessions held little interest for him, that the work itself, the building, the competing, the winning, was the only reward he sought. These explanations were accepted, repeated, codified into the mythology of Sam Walton as a man untouched by his own success. But architecture is never neutral. A house is not merely a shelter. It is a statement, a projection, a carefully constructed image offered to the world. And the house on 8th Street, in its deliberate modesty, made a statement as powerful as any mansion. It said, "I am not like them. I am one of you." This was the message Sam Walton wished to convey to his employees, to his customers, to the small towns where Walmart opened stores. He was not a distant billionaire, insulated by wealth and privilege. He was a neighbor, a friend, a man who understood the value of $1 because he had once counted everyone. The house was proof. The pickup truck was proof. The $5 haircuts were proof. The entire performance of ordinariness was designed to obscure the extraordinary machinery of accumulation operating beneath it. And it worked. For decades, the Walton family maintained an image of approachability that distinguished them from other American dynasties. They did not appear in society pages. They did not host galas or cultivate celebrity. They lived or appeared to live like the people who shopped in their stores, quietly, frugally, without excess. But the house on 8th Street contained contradictions that the mythology could not entirely conceal. Behind the modest facade, the Waltons had constructed an apparatus of privacy so complete it bordered on invisibility. The family's finances were managed through a labyrinthine network of trusts and holding companies, structures designed to preserve wealth across generations while minimizing public scrutiny. Their political contributions, funneled through multiple channels, supported causes and candidates aligned with their interests. Their influence extended into education, into philanthropy, into the shaping of public policy, always quietly, always without fanfare. The house itself became a kind of theater. Journalists who visited were shown the same rooms, told the same stories, offered the same carefully curated glimpse of Walton family life. What lay beyond that glimpse, the private meetings, the strategic decisions, the internal dynamics of a family whose collective wealth exceeded the gross domestic product of many nations, remained hidden. Helen Walton, Sam's wife, was by all accounts the guardian of this privacy. A woman of deep religious faith and fierce protectiveness, she managed the household with the same discipline her husband applied to his business. She raised 4 children in that house, Rob, John, Jim, and Alice, instilling in them a sense of duty and discretion that would define their public lives. The children attended local schools. They worked summer jobs in Walmart stores. They were taught from the earliest age that their wealth was not a license, but a responsibility. What they were not taught, or what they chose not to reveal, was how to exist in public without the armor of privacy. The Walton children grew into adults who rarely spoke to the press, who avoided photographs, who conducted their lives with a secrecy that seemed almost ancestral. The house on 8th Street had shaped them, had taught them that exposure was danger, that visibility was vulnerability. By the late 1980s, as Sam Walton's health began to fail, the house took on a different quality. It was no longer simply a home. It was a symbol of origins, of identity, of a story the family wished to preserve, even as the man who had written it slipped away. The walls held memories that would never be shared, and soon they would hold silence. The diagnosis came in 1982, multiple myeloma, a cancer that begins in the plasma cells of the bone marrow, slowly eroding the skeleton from within. The disease is incurable. It is manageable for a time, but it does not relent. The body becomes a battleground of attrition, and the outcome is never in doubt. Sam Walton was 64 years old when doctors delivered the verdict. By the standards of American life expectancy, he had perhaps 2 decades remaining. By the standards of multiple myeloma, he had far less. The median survival rate in that era was measured in months. 3 years was optimistic. 5 years was exceptional. 10 years was almost unheard of. Walton told almost no one. The decision to conceal his illness was, like so many of his decisions, strategic. Walmart was a publicly traded company. Its stock price depended on investor confidence. And investor confidence depended, in no small part, on the perception that Sam Walton, the founder, the visionary, the irreplaceable architect of the enterprise, would remain at the helm. A dying leader was a liability. A dying leader invited questions about succession, about continuity, about the future. Better to say nothing. Better to endure in silence. For nearly a decade, that silence held. Walton underwent treatment, chemotherapy, experimental protocols, the grueling rituals of modern oncology, while maintaining his public schedule. He visited stores, he attended meetings, he flew his private plane across the country, appearing at openings and anniversaries, projecting an image of vitality that bore little resemblance to the reality of his condition. Those who saw him noticed that he had aged, that his frame had thinned, that his movements had slowed, but the full truth remained hidden. The family closed ranks. Helen Walton, ever protective, managed access to her husband with increasing vigilance. The 4 children, now adults, now integrated into the Walmart hierarchy, learned to deflect questions, to change subjects, to maintain the performance their father had scripted. The inner circle tightened. The walls rose higher. By 1991, the concealment was no longer possible. Walton's decline had become visible, undeniable. He appeared at the annual shareholders' meeting in June of that year, frail and diminished, and received a standing ovation that felt less like celebration than farewell. In interviews, he began to speak of legacy, of what he hoped to leave behind, of the values he wished to see preserved. The language of mortality had entered his vocabulary. In March 1992, President George H.W. Bush traveled to Bentonville to present Walton with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. The ceremony took place not at the White House, but at Walmart headquarters, a concession to Walton's deteriorating health. Photographs from that day show a man barely able to stand, supported by his wife, accepting an award he would not live to display for long. 3 weeks later, he was admitted to the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences Hospital in Little Rock. The official statement described his condition as serious. The unofficial reality was that Sam Walton was dying, and everyone who mattered knew it. The final days were private. The family gathered, as families do, around a hospital bed. What was said in those rooms, what instructions were given, what promises were extracted, what conflicts surfaced or were suppressed, remains unknown. The Waltons did not speak of it then. They have not spoken of it since. Sam Walton died on the morning of April 5, 1992. The announcement was brief, clinical, devoid of detail. A life of 74 years, an empire of billions, reduced to a press release and a date. What followed was remarkable, not for what happened, but for what did not. There was no public struggle for control. There was no visible disagreement among the heirs. Rob Walton, the eldest son, assumed the chairmanship of Walmart with a smoothness that suggested the transition had been planned for years, as indeed it had. The company continued to expand. The stock price held steady. The machinery of accumulation did not pause. But beneath this seamless surface, questions lingered. The Walton family's wealth, at the time of Sam's death, was concentrated in Walmart stock, a holding so vast that any significant sale would have disrupted the market. The family had already begun, years earlier, to transfer assets into trusts, to restructure ownership in ways that would minimize estate taxes and preserve control across generations. The details of these arrangements were never disclosed. The legal architecture was complex, opaque, designed to resist scrutiny. Some observers noted that the timing of certain transfers, executed in the years before Walton's death, when his diagnosis was known only to a few, raised questions about disclosure, about fairness, about the obligations of a public company to its shareholders. These questions were never answered. They were never in any official forum even asked. The family's silence extended beyond finances. In the weeks after Sam Walton's death, no family member gave an extended interview. No memoir was authorized. No documentary was permitted access. The story of Sam Walton, as told to the public, remained the story Sam Walton had told about himself, curated, controlled, incomplete. And the house on 8th Street stood as it always had, modest and mute, offering no testimony. In the years following Sam Walton's death, a peculiar pattern emerged, not of revelation, but of deepening obscurity. The family that controlled the largest retail empire in history retreated further into shadow, even as their influence expanded into every corner of American life. The more powerful the Waltons became, the less visible they seemed. It was a contradiction that invited speculation, and speculation, in the absence of facts, breeds its own kind of truth. The official narrative remained intact. Sam Walton had built something extraordinary through hard work and ingenuity. His children had inherited not merely his wealth, but his values: humility, frugality, devotion to the company and its customers. The transition had been seamless because the family was united, because the founder had prepared his successors, because the Walton way was stronger than any single individual. But the official narrative, like the house on 8th Street, concealed as much as it revealed. Those who observed the family closely, journalists, analysts, former employees who spoke only on condition of anonymity, described a more complicated picture. The 4 Walton children, raised in the same house and shaped by the same father, had diverged in ways that suggested deeper fractures. Rob, the eldest, had assumed the chairmanship, but his relationship with the company was managerial rather than visionary. He lacked his father's evangelical fervor, his appetite for expansion, his intuitive understanding of the customer. He was a steward, not a builder. John, the second son, had largely withdrawn from the business. He pursued interests in yacht building and aviation, living a life more consistent with inherited wealth than entrepreneurial drive. His distance from Walmart was noted, but never explained. Whether it represented a choice or an exile remained, like so much about the family, a matter of conjecture. Jim, the third son, maintained a closer connection to the company's operations, particularly in banking and financial services. But he too remained largely invisible, appearing in public only when corporate obligations demanded it. His private life, his marriages, his interests, his beliefs was guarded with the same ferocity the family applied to all personal matters. Alice, the only daughter, emerged as perhaps the most enigmatic figure. She devoted herself to art collecting and philanthropy, amassing one of the largest private collections of American art in the world. In 2011, she would open Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, an institution of extraordinary ambition and expense. But even this public gesture was executed with characteristic Walton control. Access was managed. Interviews were rare. The museum spoke, but Alice herself remained silent. What united the siblings, beyond blood and money, was their shared commitment to privacy. A commitment so total, it suggested something more than preference. It suggested necessity. The questions that circulated in the years after Sam Walton's death were never definitively answered. Had there been conflicts over the succession? Had certain family members been marginalized or excluded? What agreements had been reached in those final months when the patriarch lay dying and the future of the empire hung in the balance? The Waltons offered no clarification. They issued no statements. They simply continued, year after year, to expand their wealth while contracting their visibility. The financial arrangements that governed the family's holdings added another layer of opacity. The Walton Enterprises Holding Company, which controlled the family's Walmart stake, operated with minimal disclosure. Board meetings were private. Decisions were announced only when legally required. The trusts that Sam Walton had established before his death, structures designed to transfer wealth to future generations while minimizing tax obligations, were shielded from public view by the architecture of American trust law. Some estimated that these arrangements had saved the family billions in estate taxes. Others suggested the figure was higher, that the Waltons had pioneered techniques of wealth preservation that would later be adopted by dynasties across the country. The precise mechanisms remained unclear. The family's lawyers and accountants, bound by professional obligation and personal loyalty, said nothing. Meanwhile, the contradictions between the Walton mythology and Walton reality grew harder to ignore. The family that celebrated frugality controlled more wealth than the bottom 40% of American households combined. The company that promised everyday low prices paid wages so low that many employees qualified for public assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, housing subsidies funded by taxpayers. The empire built on small-town values had hollowed out small towns across the nation, leaving behind empty storefronts and diminished communities. These contradictions were noted by critics, by activists, by academics who studied the Walmart effect on American society. The family did not respond. The silence that had protected them in grief now protected them in controversy. They had learned, perhaps from Sam himself, that explanation was weakness, that engagement was exposure, that the safest position was no position at all. And so the questions accumulated, unanswered, in the space the Waltons refused to occupy. The house on 8th Street, unchanged and unchanging, offered no guidance. It stood as it always had, modest, mute, inscrutable. a monument to silence itself. But silence, maintained long enough, begins to speak. The decades that followed Sam Walton's death did not bring the decline that so often accompanies the passing of a founder. There was no gradual erosion, no slow unraveling of the empire he had built. Walmart continued to expand into groceries, into pharmacies, into financial services, into markets overseas. By the turn of the millennium, the company had become the largest private employer on Earth, with more than 2 million workers spread across thousands of stores on multiple continents. The Walton family's wealth, far from diminishing, multiplied beyond all expectation. But wealth on such a scale does not exist without consequence, and the consequences, when they came, arrived from directions the family had not anticipated. The lawsuits began in earnest in the late 1990s. Employees, associates, in the company's preferred terminology, alleged systematic wage theft, forced overtime without compensation, discrimination based on gender and race. The cases multiplied, consolidated, expanded into class actions of unprecedented scope. In 2004, a federal judge certified what would become the largest civil rights class action in American history, Dukes versus Walmart, representing more than 1.5 million female employees who claimed they had been denied promotions and equal pay. The case would eventually reach the Supreme Court, which ruled in Walmart's favor on procedural grounds in 2011. But the victory was technical, not moral. The allegations lingered. The damage to the company's reputation proved harder to reverse than any legal judgment. Internationally, the expansion that had seemed so triumphant began to falter. Walmart's entry into Germany ended in failure, the company withdrawing entirely in 2006 after years of losses. The British acquisition of Asda showed promise, but never achieved dominance. In Mexico, investigations revealed widespread bribery, payments to local officials to expedite permits, and zoning approvals. The scandal, exposed by the New York Times in 2012, implicated senior executives and raised questions about what the family had known and when they had known it. No criminal charges were filed against family members. The company paid hundreds of millions in fines. The matter was closed officially, but the stain remained. Within the family itself, tragedy struck without warning. On June 27, 2005, John Walton, the second son, the one who had kept his distance, who had pursued his own path away from the company, died in a plane crash. He was piloting an ultralight aircraft near Jackson Hole, Wyoming, when it went down shortly after takeoff. He was 58 years old. The death was ruled accidental, a mechanical failure, a random catastrophe of the kind that wealth cannot prevent. John had been, in some ways, the most independent of the Walton children. He had served in Vietnam as a Green Beret, an experience that set him apart from his siblings and perhaps from his father's expectations. He had devoted much of his later life to education reform, funding charter schools and voucher programs, with a conviction that seemed personal rather than political. His death removed from the family its most unpredictable member, its least controllable voice. The remaining siblings continued as before. Rob maintained his chairmanship until 2015, when he stepped down in favor of a non-family member, the first time in Walmart's history that the company would be led by someone outside the bloodline. Jim expanded his investments in banking and real estate. Alice deepened her commitment to art and philanthropy, shaping Bentonville into a cultural destination that bore little resemblance to the sleepy town her father had chosen decades earlier. Helen Walton, the matriarch, the guardian of the family's privacy and values, died on April 19, 2007, at the age of 87. She had outlived her husband by 15 years, watching over the family and its image with the same quiet discipline she had always maintained. Her death marked the end of an era, the last direct link to the origins, to the early struggles, to the modest house where it had all begun. The house on 8th Street still stood. It had been preserved, maintained, treated with a reverence that suggested something more than sentiment. The family had donated it, along with the adjacent Walton's Five and Dime building, to form the Walmart Museum, a curated experience designed to tell the story Sam Walton had always told about himself. Visitors could walk through the rooms, see the simple furnishings, read the plaques that explained each artifact. They could purchase souvenirs in the gift shop. They could leave believing they understood something about the man and his family. But museums are not houses. They are arguments made of objects. And the argument the Walmart Museum made was the same argument the Waltons had always made, that this was a family like any other, that their success was earned, that their values were American values, that the modest rooms proved the modest hearts that had once inhabited them. The contradictions remained, unaddressed, outside the museum walls. The workers who could not afford health care, the towns that had lost their centers, the billions sheltered in trusts while public services went unfunded. These were not part of the exhibit. These were not part of the story the house was permitted to tell, and so the house became a kind of tomb, not for the dead, but for the truth. Bentonville is no longer the town Sam Walton chose. The transformation has been so complete, so deliberate, that visitors who knew the place decades ago would scarcely recognize it now. Where there were once empty storefronts and quiet streets, there are now cycling trails and art installations, farm-to-table restaurants, and boutique hotels. The population has more than quadrupled since Walton's death. The property values have climbed beyond anything the region has ever seen. The town that was once a backwater has become, through the careful application of Walton money and Walton vision, a destination. The house on Southeast 8th Street remains, but it exists now in a different context, surrounded not by the modest neighborhood of its origins, but by the infrastructure of legacy. The Walmart Museum, which incorporates the house and the original Five and Dime store, receives thousands of visitors each year. They come from across the country, from around the world, to stand in the rooms where Sam Walton once lived, to see the desk where he worked, to absorb the atmosphere of humility that the curators have so carefully preserved. The experience is immersive in its simplicity. The furniture is plain. The decorations are sparse. The kitchen is small, the bedrooms unremarkable, the living room indistinguishable from 1,000 other living rooms in 1,000 other American towns. Docents explain that this was a choice, that Sam Walton could have lived anywhere, in any manner, but chose to remain here, among ordinary things, because he was, at heart, an ordinary man. The narrative is seamless. It admits no complications. Outside the museum, Bentonville tells a different story. Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Alice Walton's monument, rises from a ravine at the edge of town, a structure of glass and wood designed by Moshe Safdie, housing a collection valued in the hundreds of millions. The museum is free to the public, funded by an endowment so large that admission will never be charged. It is by any measure an extraordinary gift. It is also an extraordinary statement of power, the power to reshape a region's cultural identity, to determine what is seen and valued, to write history in architecture. The trails that wind through Bentonville, hundreds of miles of them, among the finest mountain biking networks in the nation, were funded by the Walton Family Foundation. The restaurants, the galleries, the startups that have relocated to take advantage of the town's new amenities, all exist within an ecosystem shaped by Walton money. The family has not merely preserved their hometown, they have rebuilt it in their image. And at the center of this reconstruction, the house on 8th Street persists, a relic of a past that may or may not have existed as it is now remembered. The visitors who pass through its rooms do not see the contradictions. They do not know about the workers' lawsuits, the wage disputes, the communities transformed and diminished by Walmart's expansion. They do not consider the billions held in trusts, the political contributions, the lobbying efforts that have shaped legislation across the country. They see only the small house, the modest furnishings, the evidence of values they have been told to admire. This is the function of the house now, not to reveal, but to reassure. It exists as proof that wealth need not corrupt, that success need not change a man, that the American dream remains available to those who work hard and want little. The house makes an argument that requires no words, no defense, no engagement with contrary evidence. It simply stands, and standing, testifies. But houses, even preserved houses, cannot entirely control their meanings. The pilgrims who visit the Walmart Museum bring their own experiences, their own knowledge, their own questions. Some leave satisfied, their faith in the Walton mythology confirmed. Others leave uneasy, sensing a gap between what they have seen and what they know, between the humble rooms and the vast empire, between the story told and the story omitted. The walls absorb these reactions as they have absorbed everything else. The decades of family life, the illness concealed, the death mourned, the legacy contested. They hold what they have witnessed without judgment, without interpretation, without resolution. Bentonville continues to grow. New residents arrive, drawn by the trails and the culture and the opportunities that Walton money has created. They buy houses in neighborhoods that did not exist when Sam Walton was alive. They raise children who will know the town only as it is now, prosperous, curated, intentional. The past recedes with each passing year, becoming less memory than myth. The house on 8th Street remains, maintained and climate-controlled, protected from the deterioration that claims ordinary structures. It will stand, presumably, for as long as the family wishes it to stand, a permanent exhibit in a town that has become, in some sense, an exhibit itself. But permanence is an illusion, and exhibits, however carefully constructed, cannot anticipate every viewer. The questions that the house was built to silence have not disappeared. They have merely found other places to gather. Time moves differently for houses than for men. The bodies fail, the voices fall silent, the memories fade into conjecture and myth. But the walls remain, bearing witness to what they cannot speak, holding what they cannot release. The house on Southeast 8th Street has outlived its builder by more than 3 decades now. It has become what all such houses